I am the historian officer for PsycI. I will be introducing Dr. McDermott. Dr. McDermott is an associate professor of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, where he conducts research on the roles of stress, anxiety, trauma-related disorders on physical health, particularly migraine and other chronic pain conditions, and the mechanisms by which they contribute to medical problems and health risk behaviors such as substance abuse.
Dr. Perkins, should I share my screen? Or how it?
Yes, you now have the ability to share your screen. Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah. Let's see. Sorry, my computer has been very slow today. Whoops, let's see. Can everybody see that? I'm making sure I'm showing it correctly.
I can see the title slide.
Is it the whole slide or is it the presentation view? I'm sorry. Let me see.
I didn't see any comments on it. I just saw the slide with the title.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry about that.
And like up in the corner, a preview of what the next slide was going to be, but
okay. I apologize for my, let's see. I'll try it one more time. For some reason, let's see. Sorry. There we go. Is that the full view for you guys, not presenter view? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. I'm sorry about my technical difficulties this morning. Just the computer was going a little bit slow and getting things going. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm excited to tell everyone a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing out of my lab over the past few years. But I've also sort of decided to kind of present this with a little bit of a more general discussion of my research instead of a really specific research talk. So I might not necessarily gloss over some of the research methodology, but I might sort of spend a little bit less time talking about that and instead spend a little bit more time discussing things a little bit more generally or from a little bit of a step back perspective of what we know about psychological health and physical health and how they might overlap and how emotions and emotion regulation might play a role in like really clarifying sort of this psychological and physical health connection. So sort of this talk a little bit in the middle, not necessarily very research heavy, but not necessarily too big in terms of the general scope of things. So one of my primary interests is really examining how psychological factors can affect physical health. And there is a tremendous growing body of research showing that the experience of psychological disorders, anxiety, depression, trauma-related disorders can predictively, across time, put people at risk for the development of physical health-related conditions. This is basically any physical health-related condition you can think of. Psychological factors are going to increase the likelihood that somebody develops some of those symptoms, but then also the disability associated with physical health-related conditions. It's also the case that the experience of a physical health-related condition can put somebody at risk for the exacerbation or development of psychological related issues. For instance, if you have a chronic pain condition, that's going to increase risk for anxiety, sadness, depression, those types of experiences. And so there tends to be this fairly robust reciprocal bidirectional relationship between psychological health and physical health. It's not just me that's doing this research. There's a whole field of study sort of examining how these different seemingly sort of separate fields of study are related. And so I mentioned this sort of notion between psychological health and physical health. We definitely know that experiencing a psychological disorder puts people at risk for physical health related conditions and vice versa. So here's some data from the World Mental Health Survey. This is a little bit old, but the sort of findings have remained consistent for the last several decades. So if you look, these are just odds ratios compared to somebody who does not have an anxiety or depression related disorder. So if you look at those people with non-comorbid depression, meaning they just have a depressive disorder, if you look at some of those health related conditions, people with depression might be at 2 to 4 times greater likelihood to experience heart disease, back and neck problems, chronic headache, different pain conditions. If you look at anxiety disorders, you see the same thing. And those people with comorbid depression and anxiety are at exponentially greater risk for developing health-related conditions or having co-occurring health-related conditions. So there's a lot of evidence that these two different sort of areas of study really co-occur at high rates. Here's just some of the studies that we've done out of my lab over the last few years. So for example, we've looked at post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a significant psychological disorder associated with like difficulties managing emotional experiences following a trauma. The experience of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, we know longitudinally puts people at risk for all sorts of poor physical health related conditions. We've done a lot of work looking at borderline personality disorder, not because I'm particularly interested in borderline personality disorder as a psychological disorder, but because this disorder comes with tremendous emotional distress and emotional sort of lability up and down, and it tends to be a really intense psychological experience. That will put people at risk for pain-related conditions, exacerbation of the pain-related disability associated with pain conditions, things like migraine, headache, but also poor physical health conditions. And I'll talk about some of those studies in just a little bit. Anxiety, depression, like we already looked at, we know plays a role in physical health conditions. But it's also the case that physical health conditions will then also reciprocally affect some of these psychological conditions. So a lot of the work we've done has really established this initial relationship between some of these psychological disorders and physical health problems. And so if we know that this is the case, one of my then other areas of research is really looking at how can the emotional experience associated with both psychological health or psychological disorders affect physical health and physical conditions and help us kind of clarify how these are related. So we know that emotional suppression and emotion dysregulation, which I'll talk about in more detail in just a second, we know that those play a significant role in psychological disorders, but there also tends to be a really meaningful emotional component in physical health conditions. I mean, if you think about something as debilitating as like a chronic pain condition, on the one hand, there's a physical experience of pain, but we also know that there's an emotional experience of pain. In fact, in definition terms and by definition, you can't have pain without an emotional experience. For instance, if you were to sort of be put under anesthesia or something like that for a surgery, you would not necessarily clarify that as experiencing pain because there's no sort of awareness and emotional experience attached to that. So we know that emotional experiences play a significant role in physical health related conditions as well. And so it's possible that understanding how we manage emotional experiences might really help clarify how these areas of study are related. So I'm going to step back and spend a little bit of time talking about what we know in general from a much sort of broader field perspective about effective emotional health. So we know that the engagement in emotional suppression is significantly associated with the development of all sorts of psychological conditions. And so what do I mean by emotional suppression? I'm going through my day, I experience some unpleasant emotion, anxiety, stress, sadness, something that I don't really enjoy having. And then I engage in some attempt to sort of get rid of that emotional experience. I could distract myself by going and watching TV or doing something else. I could actively, like intentionally try to like, for lack of a better sort of metaphor that I'll talk about in a little bit, kind of like shove it down and sort of pretend that I'm not experiencing that. And while that might work in the moment, it tends to be the case that that's problematic long-term. I'm not suggesting that all emotional suppression is always problematic. Sometimes people engage in emotional suppression because it works for them a little bit. Maybe I'm a little bit anxious before giving this presentation. And so like maybe I try to do something to try to feel a little bit less anxious. That's not always problematic. But we know that when people experience significant psychological disorders and problems, there's almost always some level of emotional suppression going on. So here are some metaphors that I use clinically and even just to kind of conceptualize why emotional suppression would be problematic. So here's one that I use in clinic all the time, and it's the beach ball example. If I were to take a beach ball and you're out in the pool or out in the ocean, and I were to take this beach ball and I were to sort of push it under the water, I can do so, and I can do so effectively for a certain period of time. It takes a lot of attention, it takes a lot of effort and energy, but I can do it successfully if I need to. The problem is that because it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of sort of awareness of what's going on and intentionality to sort of manage that. What happens is over time, I might become fatigued, physically, emotionally, I might become distracted. And if anybody's ever actually tried to hold a beach ball underwater, what happens once you let go and sort of lose hold of it is that it tends to resurface. And not only does it resurface, it comes up a little bit more intensely than it was originally there before. And so, like, metaphorically, this is what we see with emotional suppression and psychological disorders. People attempt to manage by sort of shoving this emotion down or distracting. They tend to experience this re-experience of that emotion more intensely, and they haven't developed skills to appropriately manage that emotion that they're experiencing. Another metaphor that I use a lot is the sort of finger trap. If anybody's ever gone to the fair, or for whatever reason, I always got finger traps after the dentist. I had this box of like fun stuff to grab. After you go to the dentist when you're a kid, you get to go through the treasure box. I don't know, that was my dentist. They always had a nice little box and I grabbed fun stuff. And they always had these finger traps. And the finger traps are sort of an ironic experience, right? So you put your fingers into this finger trap, and how does it work and how is it funny is that the more you pull, the more you struggle, the more you attempt to manage and control that experience, the tighter things get. And the harder it is for you to actually achieve what you would like to do, which is pull your fingers out. Of course, the opposite of this is to sort of allow your fingers to kind of go a little bit closer, relax, and then eventually your fingers can kind of slide out. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about what might be effective management of emotional experiences. If I were to broaden out this definition of emotional effective management, we can talk about things in terms of emotion regulation, or the opposite of that would be emotion dysregulation. And so a little bit of a more general term about what could be problematic and how you're managing emotions is the dysregulation of emotional functioning. And so to me, what this is that it's beyond just emotional suppression. It's the lack of awareness and understanding of the emotional experiences. So you guys can think about this maybe, I've had certain experiences like this where I spend my whole day and I'm stressed or I'm feeling some unpleasant emotional experience, but because I'm kind of going and going, I'm not really aware of it. I'm not really clear of it. And if I'm not aware of it and I'm not clear about what I'm experiencing, there's the potential that it's affecting my behavior. It's causing sort of changes in how I interact with the world without me really being aware of that experience. Another characteristic of emotion dysregulation is that non-acceptance and avoidance of emotions. And we can talk about this as like, you know, suppression is one aspect of that. Like I try to kind of manage and suppress or avoid that emotional experience. And then when we talk about the engagement in meaningful behaviors, emotion dysregulation sort of plays a meaningful role in that it disrupts our ability to engage in meaningful or goal-directed effective behavior. So this would be like I'm feeling anxious and I'm like avoiding studying because I'm anxious about this exam, right? I'm not able to sort of engage in this meaningful behavior because of this emotion causing a disruption in my life. And so both of these characteristics, emotion dysregulation and emotional suppression, are really tied to a whole host of psychological disorders in terms of the sort of prediction of who might develop those problems, and then also might experience the sort of some intensification or exacerbation of those symptoms. So we know that that plays a role in depression, anxiety, borderline personality, like I just talked about, substance use disorders. Most disorders, there's an effective emotional suppression or emotion dysregulation sort of in the development and maintenance of that disorder. And so because of that, This seems like a likely target, at least from me, because of the emotional component in both of these areas of study, psychological health and physical health, that emotional suppression and motion dysregulation might play a central role. So I'll tell you about a few of the studies that we've done recently that sort of highlight the role of emotional suppression and motion dysregulation. So again, I'm going to skimp a little bit on some of the methods of these studies just to show you the sort of take-home findings. But here's a study that we did out of my lab and some collaborators across the United States, where we gathered information and data from university students. But this was a little bit sort of slanted towards those people who were experiencing BPD symptoms. So we sort of over-recruited for those people who were experiencing borderline personality characteristics, like difficulty with engagement in effective behavior when emotionally distressed, and other symptoms. And so what we did was we collected baseline assessments of borderline personality disorder symptoms, and then we had them complete daily assessments across a 2-week period of time of average pain severity for each day that they were experiencing. They didn't all necessarily have pain conditions, but we asked about, if you're in pain, what are you experiencing? Then we asked about, if you're experiencing pain, how interfering is that pain in your daily life? We asked about social distress, so difficulties with social interactions or things like that. If, for instance, you're at school and there's some difficult interpersonal interactions, how distressed were those, or how distressed were you from those interactions? And then we looked at attempts to engage in emotional suppression during those stressful events. So like, I felt stressed based on a social event or something that happened, and I attempted to sort of suppress that emotional experience. And again, we collected these on a daily sort of basis across a 2-week period of time. And then what we did was we conducted hierarchical linear modeling, where we looked at some of the baseline characteristics predictive of pain and pain-related disability, but we also looked at daily average pain and pain-related disability, but also social distress and emotional suppression at a day-to-day level. And so here's some of the findings that we found. So borderline personality disorder symptoms were not actually associated with more pain severity or social distress or attempts to suppress that distressing experience, which is interesting. It was a little bit different than some of the existing data. But what we did find was that borderline personality disorder symptoms were associated with greater average daily pain interference. So it wasn't that people with BPD or higher BPD symptoms were experiencing more pain. It was that they were more interfered or disabled by those experiences of pain. And then we also found an interesting 3-way interaction. We found an interaction between borderline personality disorder symptoms, suppression, and average daily pain interference, while controlling for somebody's average daily pain. And here's what this looks like. I know this is a lot of information. I'm going quick. So if you look at this, who experienced greater pain-related interference? It's those blue bars, right? So those are people with high borderline personality disorder symptoms. This was 1 standard deviation above the mean. Those people had greater pain-related interference, we just talked about. But there was a significant interaction here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't have a star here, but those people in this sort of second box, the high social distress and suppression, who had high BPD symptoms, they experienced the greatest amount of pain-related interference. So here's another way to look at this. If we take away borderline personality disorder symptoms and we just look at average pain interference and the effect of social distress and then emotional suppression on that, if you look at this, what you see is that those people who engaged in no suppression, that's that dotted line, as social distress went up, there was only a modest increase in effect on pain-related interference. But if you look at those people who engaged in emotional suppression, as social distress goes up, there was an exponential increase in interference. So really, it's that on the one hand, does social distress cause and affect pain-related interference? The answer is yes, to some extent. But really, we see this interference among those people who experience social distress and then attempt to suppress it. So again, really problematic in the notion that it's identifying sort of emotional suppression as one of those factors that might link the effect of psychological health on physical health. All right, so if that's emotional suppression, and then we step it back and we talk about emotion dysregulation a little bit more broadly, here's another study that we did. This was an interesting longitudinal study across time, where we looked at the role of borderline personality disorder symptoms on general poor physical health related conditions through changes in emotion dysregulation. And by the way, if I'm going really fast and somebody wants to sort of stop me or ask a question, I'm happy to kind of stop and discuss real quick. I think I'm still doing okay on time. So for this study, this was a little bit of a different sample. We collected assessments from 118 females who had experienced, again, we oversampled for borderline personality disorder symptoms. So this was a general population, not a university sample, but we recruited for those people who might experience sort of higher levels of BPD. So it's not necessarily representative of a national sample. It's a little bit slanted towards those people who experience BPD symptoms. And then what we did was we collected baseline assessments of borderline personality disorder symptoms, emotion dysregulation, and physical health. But we also, let me see if I have a picture of this. We also collected data from those same reports, BPD symptoms, emotion dysregulation, and physical health, across 3 different time points. So baseline, 4 months later, and then 8 months later. And we did, again, similar sort of modeling. This was slightly different. It was structural equation modeling to look at the effect of borderline personality disorder symptoms on physical health, but also the indirect effect of borderline personality disorder symptoms on physical health through changes in emotion dysregulation. And so here's what we found. So at baseline, if we look at baseline and then 8 months down the line, those people who had greater BPD symptoms reported greater physical health problems. So these were general physical health related ailments. So aches and pains, cold and flu related symptoms, those types of things. It wasn't necessarily specific pain or chronic health condition as much as it was like general physical ailments. And so what we know then is that borderline personality disorder is associated with sort of down the line physical health problems. But then when we looked at emotion dysregulation at the 4th month, we found that there was a significant mediating effect. So borderline personality disorders affected physical health related symptoms through increased emotion dysregulation at that 4-month period. So what this is saying is that borderline personality disorder symptoms might affect physical health problems by disrupting how we manage emotional experiences. This then in turn disrupted emotional management or sort of dysregulation, kind of managing these unpleasant emotional experiences, then might put people at risk for poor physical health related conditions. And so it's this sort of mediating model that, again, it shows that sort of how we manage and approach emotional experiences can play a meaningful role in physical health. If you notice the pathway after we accounted for emotion dysregulation, it's still significant. And so what this is saying is that emotion dysregulation is not the only factor that might be relevant in why BPD symptoms might increase risk or increase poor physical health problems. There's probably other things going on as well. So while this is a meaningful component of the story, it's maybe not the whole story. So if we know that things like emotional suppression and emotion dysregulation really help to kind of clarify potentially or provide some clarification of how psychological factors might affect poor physical health, then a question that I have, sorry, I have an extra slide here. A question I have was that what if you could sort of do something to improve physical health or a physical health related approach, not necessarily on the problematic side, but I might do something that benefits physical health. Could that in turn affect psychological health in a beneficial way? And if it does, could that affect psychological health through changes or improvements in how we regulate emotions? So it's basically the same question. It's just the reverse side of the sort of same coin. So instead of psychological problems causing poor physical health, I'm looking at maybe we could do things on a health side to improve health that might in turn affect psychological health through emotion regulation or how we manage emotional experiences. So what do we know about something like physical exercise and psychological health? every clinician in the world, everybody that's just interested in psychology or interested in psychological health will tell you that if you exercise, there are potential psychological benefits. I agree with this. However, it's not a straightforward type of narrative that if you're stressed, you should go and exercise because it's going to help your mental health. So let's talk about this for a little bit. What do we know about the relationship between exercise and mental health and psychological health? First, the meta-analytic data of hundreds and hundreds of studies show that there is an effect of exercise on psychological health. However, it's modest and it's inconsistent. So for every study that shows you get a group of people who are depressed, you go and have them exercise, you measure depression later on, they demonstrate lower depression. For every study like that, there's another study that shows you get a group of people who are depressed, you have them exercise, meh, it doesn't really affect psychological health. They're still depressed. So that's not a clear-cut sort of narrative that all you need to do is go and exercise. There's more going on here. Here's one issue for me conceptually, though, about how we typically think about how exercise might affect physical health. If I'm stressed and I go and exercise, and then I feel less stressed after I exercise, I'm sure this is beneficial, and I'm never going to tell anybody not to do this. I do it myself. I'm feeling stressed, I might go and exercise, I feel better. But if we think about this conceptually, it walks a dangerous sort of narrow, thin line between being beneficial of psychological health and emotional suppression and avoidance. So I'm feeling distressed. I've had a rough day emotionally. I'm not really enjoying the way I'm feeling. I go and exercise. The function of that exercise is it makes me feel better. I think that's probably an all right thing. I'm not saying don't do it, but isn't that a subtle form of emotional avoidance, emotional suppression, a non-willingness to kind of sit with that emotional experience? So there's some conceptual issues in why I'm not sure that exercise is beneficial in the way we think it's beneficial. I feel stressed, I go exercise, I feel better. To be clear, I think exercise is beneficial, but here's what I think might be going on. There are a number of studies. There's one researcher, she was a graduate student and then a postdoctoral student at Harvard Psychological, so their psych department. And she did a lot of really cool work as part of her early career. I think she's moved off and is doing different stuff. But she has a number of really cool studies that show if you exercise or if you exercise regularly and then you're distressed, you experience less distress and you're better able to bounce back from that distress than if you weren't exercising regularly. So notice what we've switched here is when the exercise occurs. Here, the exercise is not occurring after you're stressed. The exercise is occurring regularly or before you're stressed. And then when you're stressed, you're better able to manage that distressing experience. That's not really avoidance anymore. That's a different sort of function. That's saying if maybe I'm improving physical health, does that then in turn improve the way that I manage emotional experiences in subsequent events? And does that then play a role in my psychological health? And so there's some really interesting studies coming out of that lab, but it's still really preliminary. And we saw it to sort of do a similar type of study and see if we got kind of similar findings. So this was something we did a couple of years ago, and we've just been really slow to publish this. COVID came and I've got it mostly written up. I just haven't actually submitted it. So this is not sort of peer-reviewed data. This is still sort of stuff that's in preparation. Unfortunately, I've been sitting on it for too long and I need to get it submitted. But here's a really cool study that we did where we collected data from UL students, and it was only 32 of them, but I'll show you the kind of design in a second. So here's what it looks like. We collected baseline assessments where we asked about difficulties in emotion regulation, but then we assessed for physical health. So we actually had them do what's called a VO2 max assessment. And this is, in simple terms, a measurement of somebody's overall sort of aerobic capacity, how healthy they are to begin with. So we assessed baseline characteristics, and then participants were randomly assigned to either be in an exercise condition or in a rest control condition. That was on a separate day, at least 72 hours after they did the original assessment. And so we've got sort of some distance in time between those assessments. And then participants at a later date were then assigned to the opposite condition. So if they were in the exercise condition first, they went to the rest control and vice versa. And so this is what the exercise and sort of rest control condition looked like within the actual study design. So within that assessment at time 2 and time 3. When participants came in, we assessed baseline negative affect. So how unpleasant are they feeling, right? It just sort of in just a general sense. In this moment, are they experiencing anxiety, depression, sadness, that kind of stuff? We assessed momentary management of emotional experiences. So momentary emotion dysregulation, not broad, sort of more trait or state-like characteristics, more of like this, like right now, how are you managing that emotional experience? And then we assessed physiological measures of emotional distress like cortisol and heart rate. Participants then either did the rest control where they did nothing, they just sat for 30 minutes, or they did an exercise intervention for 30 minutes where we set an exercise bike at 50% of their VO2 max. So everybody did an exercise that was titrated to their own level of health and aerobic capacity. So it wasn't like we just said, go exercise for 30 minutes. We said, go exercise for 30 minutes. And everybody had relative to their own health, the same exercise experience. Then what we did was we assessed time 2, negative affect, momentary emotion dysregulation, cortisol and heart rate. And then what we did was we stressed them out. We did this behavioral task that is pretty common. We certainly use it in the lab fairly regularly. If you guys have done some of our studies, you might have actually done this. I'll explain it in just a second. It's a math task that's like very effective at causing emotional distress in the moment. After they did that, then what we did was we assessed negative affect, momentary emotion dysregulation again, cortisol and heart rate, which are those biomarkers of physiological arousal. So here's the stress task that we do. It's called the paced auditory serial addition task. And it's a fancy acronym to mean basically we ask participants to add the numbers that are presented on the screen to subsequent numbers on the screen. So here's how it works. It was originally developed to measure cognitive deficits and identify those people with like intellectual disabilities. And the original design was that you were shown a number. Let's say that number was a 7. The number would then disappear and another number would be presented, and that would be a 12, let's say, for example. Participants are simply asked to add those numbers together, 7 plus 12, and indicate 19. You can see the cursor there. But here's how it also works. The 12 would then disappear, and another number might show up. Let's say that's a 5. Participants are asked to disregard the sum, it's not 19 anymore, and simply add the number presented to the previously presented number. So if a 5 is presented, you just add it to the 12 that was previously there, and that would be 17. I know it sounds tricky. It's all right. You don't need to actually get it. If you do this pretty slow, it's something that most people can kind of do. It's not tremendously distressing. But what we do is we kind of ramp it up a little bit. So there's 3 different blocks. Participants in the second block or in the first block, they have 3 seconds to do the actual response. In the second block, they have 2 seconds. And then in the third block, they have 1 second to do it. So numbers are being presented very, very quickly. But we add a little bit extra to sort of cause some additional emotional distress. Folks have headphones on, and there's like this computer game sort of explosion sound. It doesn't actually hurt anybody's ears, but it's like this kind of sound. When you speed up the presentation of these numbers and you've got these explosions going, it's very distressing. And so this task elicits emotional distress. It's not physically harmful in any way, but it causes some like frustration and emotional distress. And then what we do at some point in the last one, we give the option to quit at any time they want. And so participants can sort of quit when they become too distressed. And this gives us a way of, again, titrating. We're going to get people stressed to a level that they decide I can't do it anymore, and they quit. So here's what we found. We found that trait-based characteristics, not truly trait, but sort of more general ways that people manage emotional experiences, was significantly associated with both pre and post-stressor momentary emotion dysregulation, independent of condition. This is not a surprising finding. This is saying that the way I manage emotional experiences generally affects the way I manage emotional experiences in the moment, whether I'm distressed or not. That makes sense. That's not groundbreaking. We also found that there was a significant effect of time on negative affect. What this means is that independent of exercise or rest condition, those people, everybody in the study, when they got stressed, had an increase in negative affect. What this says is that our stressor was successful. We caused increased distress. But notice, this is really important. We saw increased momentary distress, negative affect in both groups, our exercise and our rest control group. So we successfully stressed everyone out, whether they exercised or not. We didn't find any effect of condition, meaning exercise or time, on some of the physiological assessments, potentially because we had a small sample size. And so I'm not going to make too much of that. But here's what we did find. We found a significant condition, meaning exercise versus rest, by time, baseline, time 2, time 3, interaction on momentary emotion dysregulation when we controlled for changes in emotional distress. So changes in emotional distress, everyone got distressed. If we control for that, what we found was this interaction by time and condition on momentary emotion dysregulation. I'll clarify this in just a second. When we looked within subjects, just at the individual level, we saw that those people in the rest condition had a significant increase in emotion dysregulation in the moment across those time periods. When they became distressed, they had an increase in how well they were regulating or how poorly they were regulating their emotional experiences. But we didn't see this for the exercise condition. So here's what this looks like. If we look at momentary emotion dysregulation, time 1 and time 2, which is baseline, and then the post-intervention, whether they had the exercise or rest condition, but before they got stressed out, we saw no real change. It looks like it goes down a little bit, but there was no significant change in how somebody was managing emotional experiences in the moment. But then when we stressed them out, we saw a significant increase in momentary emotion dysregulation for the rest group, but not for the exercise group. So this is an interesting picture that this paints. First, does exercise stop us from feeling emotionally distressed when stressors might come up in our environment? At least what we're finding is probably not. So if you exercise, you're probably just as likely to experience emotional distress when stuff comes up in your life than anybody else who doesn't exercise. But what we're seeing is that you might maintain your levels of how you manage those emotional experiences better than somebody who's not exercising or doesn't exercise. So this doesn't say that exercise causes us to feel less distress. It doesn't even say that it allows us to regulate emotions better. But what it shows us is that it allows us to remain stable in how we manage emotions and not become dysregulated. So we'll talk about that, and I'm happy to answer kind of questions on that. It's an interesting finding that shows like exercise, that's awesome, but don't exercise because it helps you feel less distressed. Exercise because it helps buffer you throughout the day. When you come in contact with stressors, you're better able to sort of maintain your effective management of those stressors as you go through your day. Whereas if you're not exercising, potentially you become more dysregulated. Okay, so that was a study showing sort of this sort of flip side of the same coin, that physical health or improvements of physical health through exercise or something like that might affect psychological health, but might do so in sort of how it improves your ability or sort of buffers your ability to manage emotional experiences. All right, so what's some of the take-home message? Here's the good news. We have a tremendous body of research that shows that interventions that target emotion regulation can be really successful. So we have interventions that allow us to sort of directly target one of these primary mechanisms that might be contributing to psychological and physical health. There are a dozen different studies, hundreds of different studies that show that at some level, if you teach people effective emotion regulation skills, you see improvements in psychological health. It's also possible, given some of these data, that we might see improvements in physical health through some of these sort of same interventions, which is really nice because they already exist. We don't have to sort of recreate the wheel here. So there are all sorts of interventions that attempt to improve how we manage emotional experiences. So here's what this looks like. On purpose, sort of working with people to train skills where they can become more aware of what they're experiencing at any given moment. I mentioned earlier that I might have days where I walk through my day and it's not until the end of the day that I check in and I'm like, oh man, I've had a really stressful day. What if we could on purpose check in more regularly, notice those emotional experiences we're having, and then become a little bit more clear about what those emotional experiences are kind of pushing us. So we know that emotional experiences that are unpleasant have like these emotional urges. They kind of like nudge us a little bit to do certain things. I feel anxious, that kind of nudges us to do something to avoid. I feel sad. These emotions kind of nudge us to sort of remove ourselves or to slow down, those types of things. And so if I can become more aware of those emotional experiences, more clear about what those emotional experiences are kind of nudging me to do, I can then make intentional decisions to override that if I find it meaningful, or if I find it in line with something that's a goal for me to do. So for instance, maybe today I've got a stressful day, I've got this talk, I've got other things. If throughout the day, I'm spending time checking in on my emotional experiences, a little bit sort of adding a little bit of a clarity to it. What am I experiencing? Improving my willingness to kind of just sit with that instead of trying to suppress it like we talked about before. And then engage in meaningful stuff. I'm still going to come to this talk. I'm going to do this presentation. I've got patients later today. I'm going to sort of be really focused on that. And while I'm doing that, if I'm improving my momentary emotional regulation, maybe that's going to be beneficial to both psychological health and physical health. There are already even broader treatments that really target emotion dysregulation, but other meaningful characteristics of psychological health, like dialectical behavioral therapy. So DBT is one of the few empirically supported treatments for borderline personality disorder. I mentioned that earlier. BPD is really associated with this disruptive emotional experiencing and functioning, and then that plays a role in that in social interactions and interpersonal interactions, and it's really disruptive. And there's some comprehensive interventions that impart, in addition to mindfulness, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness characteristics, target improvements in emotional functioning. So again, we have these treatments and interventions that are already in place. We know they work for psychological conditions, and we know that they work by in part improving how we manage emotional experiences. So isn't it potentially beneficial that we could do these same things and get sort of this added benefit of increased physical health as well? And then at the same time, we know that if we can do interventions to improve one, psychological health or physical health, we might see improvements in the other simply because it's affecting how we manage these emotional experiences. So that's the end of my talk. I'm not sure how much time we actually have, but I'm happy to kind of take some questions. I kind of rushed through it because I didn't want to go too long, but I'll let Cindy take over and sort of let me know what the plan is.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDermott. Now is time for a question and answer session. If anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how I can, let's see.
I have like a stupidly broad question, but I figure I'll give it a shot, and then you can tell me why my question maybe isn't.
I'll try to answer it the best that I can, but I don't know that I can answer.
You, based upon like your understanding, what? I mean, and this doesn't have a simple answer, a deceptively simple question. What is pain?
Oh, okay. So going back to like a pain experience.
Yeah. What the heck is it? It feels it's deceptively complex, it feels like.
Yeah. So maybe what I can do, I can talk quickly about pain and pain experience, but then I can also talk about our models for understanding effective management of pain and how those models actually map on pretty much identically to our experience of emotional pain or psychological pain and effective management of those. So when I think about pain and when I think about emotional experiences, I don't think good and bad. So when I think about physical pain, Most people think pain is bad, when most people think anxiety and stress and depression is bad. But for me, I think about, why would we have pain or sadness or anxiety? The answer to me is that it's beneficial. It's there for a reason. So first and foremost, if somebody's experiencing pain, pain is a physiological process, at least in an acute sense, is a physiological process by which receptors are communicating information to our brain, telling us that there's some tissue damage, right? So if we go to the basic sense, and if that's the case, although pain doesn't feel very good, pain is adaptive. If I hurt myself, then my body is telling me that there's been some level of tissue damage or some level of injury. And because I know that, I can then attend to it. I can do things like try to manage it or try to sort of avoid doing things that hurt it worse. And in fact, there are people who experience conditions where their experience of pain is very minimal or non-existent. And those people experience significant disability in their life. If you are walking around without the ability to feel pain, then you might potentially engage in behaviors that harm yourself without any knowledge of that, and then persist in those same behaviors. You might put your, metaphorically, I don't think that this actually happens, put your hand on a hot stove and have no recognition that there's some tissue damage being caused to pull it away. So while we think of pain as being problematic, it's really an incredibly adaptive sense. It's an incredibly meaningful, helpful process by which our body tells us that there's something off. If I think about emotions, it's the same model. Feeling anxious tells me that there's something in my life that's really not certain, and it pushes me into action some way. It's not necessarily the case that that action is beneficial or problematic, but without that sense, imagine if you felt no anxiety your whole life. It might seem like that would be bliss. It might seem amazing. Like, what if I could just like snap my fingers and I had some like Thanos ability to like take away all anxiety in the world? That might seem like it would be amazing, but nobody would get anything done. There'd be no little bit of like, you know, oh, I need to do this thing because I'm not certain how it's going to sort of play out. People would be crossing the roads and not look left and right. People would be doing all sorts of behaviors with no sort of recognition that there's the potential for harm or uncertainty. So that's the first thing. And I know I'm super indirectly answering your question, Dr. Perkins. So pain, in that regard, to me, is a physiological sensation, much like vision and auditory sensations that give us information about the world. So we can think about pain as like a physical, sort of neurological process. However, the two, emotional experiences and pain, are linked in a way that like cannot be sort of differentiated. You can't sort of pull these apart. And by that, I mean, when somebody experiences pain, there is also an emotional component that comes with that pain at the same time. There is no such thing as pain without the emotional experience. Now, some people might experience it less emotionally distressing, but there's some level of an emotional experience there. So pain to me is the physical and emotional experience telling me that my body has some sort of tissue damage. That's acute pain. There's another discussion about chronic pain. Chronic pain can sort of build and develop over time. And this is the body sort of signaling that there's something wrong when maybe there is no longer any existing tissue damage. Let's talk about how chronic pain develops and how psychological disorders develop. We know that those models are the same. So again, momentary emotional experiences, whether they feel good or feel bad, are beneficial. Momentary pain experiences, which feel bad, are beneficial. Nobody is suggesting that chronic emotional distress, chronic pain experiences are beneficial. They become less beneficial when they sort of ramp up and they start to impair our ability to sort of engage in a meaningful sort of goal-directed life. So here's what we know about pain. Tell me if this model sounds familiar. Two people experience some injury. Maybe they both fall and they break their arm. One person feels pain. They notice it. They spend some time avoiding that, sort of maybe they get it casted, that kind of stuff. But once the tissue damage has healed, they then start doing things that are engaging in that pain. In fact, if anybody's ever been in physical therapy, what do? My wife cracked her elbow one time really bad. She fell on some ice and cracked the top of her elbow all the way down her arm. It was really significant injury. She started physical therapy after they took her out of the sort of splint that they had her in. And what did they do? They like extended it and they made her do exercises, and it caused a lot of pain. It was the exact opposite of an avoidance of that thing that causes a little bit of pain. And what happens over time is it strengthens muscles, it actually improves functioning, you get better mobility, and ironically, the pain dissipates. Pain dissipates. What do we know about those people who experience that same thing and then they get the cast off or the splint off and then they avoid doing things that cause that little slight bit of pain? What do we know? They start being very vigilant of stuff around them that might cue the experience of pain. They avoid doing things like extending the arm. And over time, what happens is through disuse, through lack of like physical development, that pain condition not only gets worse, it actually develops and exacerbates, but they have less mobility. They have less functioning. So their impairment is increased. And then when they actually try to go do something, they experience more pain. And then they're more vigilant of those things. They then avoid, and it sort of cycles up and up. So it's very similar to the way we avoid emotional experiences. Again, momentary avoidance of stuff is not bad. Nobody's saying that's bad. If I feel physical pain and I do something to stop that pain, that's awesome. If I feel emotional distress and it tells me something about my world and I do something in the moment to kind of manage that and it's an avoidance, that's not necessarily problematic. But if my general approach is an avoidance or suppression in an attempt to manage and to avoid that experience, whether it's pain or emotional experiences, we know that that builds and intensifies that experience, both in disuse, disability, and intensity of the experience. So how do chronic pain conditions develop? Through hypervigilance of those things that trigger pain or cue pain, avoidance of those things, and that cycle grows and grows. How do psychological disorders develop? The same thing. I experience an emotional thing that's distressing. I maybe do something to manage that at the moment, but then that develops, it grows. I start to then avoid more things that are associated with that experience. So for instance, if I'm fearful of driving over bridges, I have a bridge phobia. Maybe I start avoiding bridges. I maybe avoid these small bridges. The next time I come up to a bridge, what have I learned? I've learned that bridge is scary. I need to avoid it. And then I start to avoid more. Then I experience more anxiety when I come back up to it. This is classic negative reinforcement for all the psych students in here. As that develops, the sort of experience that I have is more intense. That cycles up, and then it actually generalizes to larger bridges, etc. So what is pain? Pain is an adaptive function that through the way we process it can become problematic. I don't know if that was completely a long-winded answer for your sort of question of what is pain, but that's pain.
No, that was awesome. It's a difficult thing to wrap around, brain wise. So
yeah, it's all backwards. It's all the opposite. You injure yourself, go ahead and take some time to recover, but then start doing stuff that kind of pushes that. That's hard, yeah.
I do have I have another question, but I'm going to delay because I want anybody else to have a chance to jump in. I don't want to dominate.
Okay. I think it's just you, Dr. Perkins.
Okay. So there are interesting metaphors that humans have created related to psychological pain that are physical metaphors, right? So then, like experience a major loss or disappointment, a very common metaphor is I'm experiencing heartbreak or heartache or,
They tie it to a physical sort of experience.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I have experienced at times major loss where I literally had the experience of pain in my heart, and so I guess you may be able to speak to this in terms of data, but I would accept wild speculation as well. Is this, I see this potentially being two things or both, which is that my history with the word, and with this metaphor causes me to convert my psychological pain into that physical sensation through some kind of like circular mechanism, or that the metaphor itself may be based upon a real relationship between psychological pain and common physical sort of sensations that it engenders, so that maybe grief really, without even our help, does create that tightness in the chest, or so so I guess I'm wondering, is it one, the other, both? Do we have, do you feel like that we have grounds to at least speculate on that, or is it more than that?
So I can say for sure, no uncertainty, your latter sort of process that you just explained is definitely in place. So I'll talk to that in a second. There is 100% a physical component to the emotional experience that we have. Those two coincide. The same way that there's an emotional component to physical health experiences. It's also possibly the case that metaphors that we use might also affect how we're experiencing those things. Dr. Bro can talk about that, I'm sure, much more detail than me. So that's probably the case. There's probably something going on that I use the term "my heart's breaking," so then I take time and I focus on the physical sensation of it. I'm sure that's there. I can't speak to that as much. I'm not discounting that. But 100%, the same way that when you experience a physical thing like pain, there is an emotional component that comes with it, that's tied to it. We know that there is a physical component that's tied to the emotional experience. There is, I mentioned this in my class the other day, and I'm bringing it up again. It's a fun read. It's one of my favorite books, just to it's related to my interest, and it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's written by one of the foremost evolutionary biologists in the world. His name's Robert Sapolsky. He's like the guy. When he was in graduate school, he published a paper in Nature, which is one of the largest academic journals in the world. And he's a graduate student. I did this study and published it in Nature. If any of us in this department publish in Nature, it would be massive, university news. We would it would be huge. So this guy writes a book about why zebras don't get ulcers. And the whole narrative is about that when we experience a psychological effect or a psychological emotion, like anxiety or stress, for instance, we experience it in a number of ways. We experience it cognitively, we experience the thoughts associated with emotional experiences like anxiety, oh, I'm worried, I'm having thoughts of uncertainty, I might not perform well in this exam, the thoughts that come with it. We know that there's that emotional component, what it feels like. So I feel anxious. It's not really a way to clarify. It's not a tangible sensation, but it's the emotion of that. But then there's also the physical sensation that comes with that. What comes with something like stress and anxiety? Increased heart rate. We know that there's all sorts of a cascade of effects. So for example, let's say you get in the car and somebody swerves into your lane and you narrowly avoid them. In that 1 second, what happens is there's this tremendous change physiologically. You have increased heart rate, you have increased respiration, you have increased blood flow to your extremities, to your muscles to allow you to respond quicker. You have actually this diversion of blood flow from your other internal organs that don't need that blood at that moment, like digestion and stuff like that, sexual reproduction. All of that gets halted because it's not as necessary in that moment to your survival. Whether you're able to digest your breakfast is not meaningful if you die in a car crash. And so all of this stuff happens, and it's really, really fast, and it's really intense. That's if you have an intense emotional experience. If you have a moderate emotional experience, a similar type of thing is happening, but it's at an equal sort of level. So you're experiencing this physiological change emotionally. And then, of course, the sort of answer to the question of why zebras don't get ulcers, this is a separate discussion, would be a zebra gets attacked by a lion, it runs off, it defends itself, it makes its way. 10 minutes later, it's out grazing, it's doing its thing, its physiological arousal has dropped, because it's effectively managed that it's stressor in the environment, the emotions drop, it's doing its thing. With humans, we activate that same stress response, anxiety, depression. We activate it very often, usually when there's not necessarily a tangible stressor there. We're doing it all the time. We're stressed, we're anxious, that kind of stuff. And what that's doing is it's turning on that physical component, and it's allowing it to sort of run hot for a really long time. And that actually takes a really big toll on your physical health. So why do people get ulcers? Because we're turning on that process that's meant to be used in the moment. We're turning it on chronically. All that to say, that's a really long answer to like, is there a physical component to the emotional experience? The answer is 100%. And those were just some examples of the physical components that come with the emotional experience. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that you experience an emotion and there's an equal sort of physical sensation that comes with it.
Thank you. And yeah, I've had recent experiences of loss that you just feel the tightening.
Yeah. And maybe it has a physical component, but then also because it's a change in your physical experience, we're then able, like we tend to focus on that a little bit more. So maybe throughout the day, you're not focused on your heartbeat or your heart, but then something distressing happens. There's a change in how your heart's beating. You're then a little bit more vigilant of it. So you recognize it a little bit more, so it stays with you. Certainly loss and grief really affects physical functioning, and we're more attuned to that when it feels unpleasant.
Well, that concludes our first session for today. Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Dr. McDermott, for presenting and speaking with us today. I guess there'll be more sessions throughout the day. So if anyone wants to come back, there'll be about 4 or 5 more sessions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.